Okay, we're live here. This is Robert Cotto, school board member in Hartford, lecturer at Trinity College in the Ed Studies program. And we're here today to talk a little bit about the CJEF versus REL case. It's a school funding case. And I'm here with attorney and writer Wendy Lecker. So Wendy, could you just tell us a little bit about who you are and a little bit about your background so we know where you're coming from and talking about the case today?
Sure. I am a public school parent in Stamford and taxpayer and resident of Stamford, and an education columnist with several Connecticut newspapers. But I'm also a school funding and school equity attorney with the Education Law Center, which is based in Newark, New Jersey. But I cover New York State school equity and school funding issues.
Okay, great. So as you know, yesterday and today, the CJEF versus REL school funding case is wrapping up, and I wanted to ask you from kind of the top level interpretation. What is this CJEF versus REL case all about?
CJEF versus REL is a case that challenges Connecticut's school funding system. The CJEF case is being brought on behalf of children and parents in Connecticut's poorest school districts, districts with high levels where the students have there's a high level of poverty, significant populations of English language learners, and significant populations of children with disabilities. So the students are high need and the towns are low wealth, meaning that they can't raise a lot of money with their own local revenue. And they contend that the way the state currently funds schools does not give them enough money to provide all the resources their kids need to learn. And by failing to fund schools adequately, they're violating the constitutional rights of children in those districts.
Mm-hmm. And this is a case just in Connecticut, right?
Correct, although there have been similar cases all across the United States.
Okay. And you had mentioned towns that are generally have people that don't earn very much income and don't have a lot of taxable property wealth. Can you just name maybe two or three towns that were like that kind of are typical of that category?
Sure, New Britain, New London, Bridgeport. Those are some of the Wyndham. Those are some of the Waterbury. Well, I'm not sure if Waterbury. I think Waterbury is part of the district, but I know Danbury, East Hartford, New Britain, New London, Wyndham, Bridgeport. Those are some of the districts that are involved in this case.
Okay. So I've been watching the wrap up of the trial on the Connecticut network CTN, and yesterday the judge for the case and the lawyers that are representing the plaintiffs, the different towns, and also the parents that are involved in bringing forward this lawsuit. And one of the questions that they had, or I should say the judge had for the lawyer was, isn't this case just about having enough money for kids in school and paying for public education? And more specifically, the judge was saying kind of didn't really understand the difference between this idea of adequate funding and equitable funding. And so I'm curious about whether you can just take a minute and just kind of maybe break that down for us, because it seemed like they really took a lot of time, and people might not understand, why the CJEF case is saying they want adequate and equitable funding.
Sure. So adequacy is a constitutional notion. Every state constitution, including Connecticut's, has a provision in its constitution, a clause guaranteeing a free public education to all children. What the CJEF case has fleshed out, and similar cases in Connecticut and across the country over the years, is what does that mean? What's an education that the state needs to provide that would be enough, a constitutional minimum? And what the Connecticut Supreme Court has fleshed out so far is that they have made a very strong statement that education is really key to safeguarding our democracy, so that we need to ensure as a state that we're providing children with an education that enables them to be responsible citizens, to participate in democracy, to vote, to sit on a jury, and also to be productive members of society, to obtain gainful employment and be able to go on to higher education. So that's the constitutional minimum in Connecticut. That's adequacy. Equity means really taking a look at, on the grand level, two general areas. One is not every child has a right to an adequate education, but not every child starts the same place. Children who don't know English need to be given enough resources so they learn English before they can learn material in English. Children who live in poverty, it's been proven that they have a lot of, they live with a lot of stress in their life that serves as an obstacle to learning. So children who live in poverty often need to have other needs met. They often need social workers in order to ensure that they have enough food and that they have enough, they have adequate clothing and that they deal with the trauma in their life. They need extra services in order to get the same educational opportunity. Children with disabilities often need extra services to ensure they get the same educational opportunity. So the notion of equity, number one, is to make sure that every student, no matter what his or her need is, has enough resources. It also means that the state not only has to provide enough funding on the whole, so that there is enough funding for schools, but that they need to distribute it equitably. Some districts, like the districts involved in CJEF, can't raise enough revenue or the same kind of revenue that wealthy districts can. That it requires a lot of tax effort, disproportionate tax effort to raise just a small amount of money that it would take in a wealthy district. So equity also means that you have to distribute that funding equitably.
Mm-hmm. And so just like to throw out like a hypothetical situation, in the case of like, let's say one particular child, or even a whole class of children, let's say that there's a district like Hartford, where I'm from, and the school district decides, well, we think that the best and most appropriate way to educate these students is to give them kind of an online program, and somewhat in place of what we would know as traditional school, and they, can take a few hours learning things online and then taking a couple tests and getting credit for that sort of thing. I guess in the case of a high schooler, would that be considered kind of an adequate education, or is that not really what we're talking about here? Can you think of maybe a better example of what we're talking about when we talk about adequate and equitable? Like what does that look like for a student?
Courts have dealt with this very issue. What kind of resources are necessary in school in order to give kids an adequate, constitutionally adequate education? And they've brought in witnesses both from districts and national witnesses. And as I said, there have been cases all across the country that deal with school funding, and I think about 45 states so far have had these kind of cases, and there's emerged a remarkable consensus on what resources they need in every school in order to ensure that kids have an adequate education. Small class size, especially in the early years. Adequate facilities, that means buildings that aren't falling apart, that have enough space. Books, adequate books and textbooks and computers. A breadth of course offerings. Extra time for kids who need extra time, and additional help for kids who need extra help, both social and academic support. And some states, and there's a big consensus emerging, and I know that the CJEF plaintiffs are asking for pre-K. There's there is near universal consensus across this country that pre-K is an adequate, is an essential resource for education. And now some courts have said that that should be part of a constitutional education. So no, it does not involve sitting a kid in front of a computer.
Okay, I'm just wanted to check, because some folks may got it twisted over here in Hartford. So here's the kind of the so what question about the CJEF case. Let's say that the plaintiffs that are suing the state for adequate and equitable funding of public schools, let's say that they end up winning this case, and the judge says, "Yep, you're right. Currently, Connecticut's school funding system is not constitutional." What's the so what? What happens if I'm a parent or if I'm a kid in a public school in Connecticut? What does that mean for me?
Well, the witnesses in this case have shown that these schools and the children in these schools are being deprived of essential educational resources. There are not enough textbooks in these schools. Buildings are falling apart. They don't have any social workers to serve the needs of kids. They don't have enough academic intervention so that when kids come to school behind, they can't catch them up because they don't have enough teachers that provide those kind of services. So, and the list goes on. So if the court were to say, you know, you're right, the funding system is the problem, the state funding system is the problem, and would order, as courts have done in many other cases across this country, if the court were to order, fix your funding system so you provide adequate and equitable state funding, then the kids in those schools would finally get the services they need, because they would get enough funding to provide the social workers, the academic intervention, the after-school support, the summer school, pre-K, books, and all the other basics of education that these kids need. So for the kids in these districts, it would be monumental. But I would also say for all kids across Connecticut and for our whole society, it would be monumental, because if we don't pay for education now, we are, as a society, going to pay sometime later and down the line in the costs of providing services to those people who can't be employed because they didn't get an education, or people who engage in risky behavior and end up having health problems or criminal justice problems because they did not get an adequate education. So we as a society are invested not only in making sure that our own kids are educated, but all kids in our state are educated.
Mm-hmm. All right, I want to switch gears a little bit, away from the CJEF case, and like I said, switch gears a little bit to a group of advocates involved with like kind of school funding, research, and some other things related to public education. Recently came out with a press release saying, actually not mentioning the CJEF case at all, and instead just saying, well, you know, Connecticut, in order to make public education better, just needs to have a new formula in terms of how we give out or, you know, allot public education dollars. So in other words, you know, the Connecticut may be spending a certain amount right now, but all we need to do really is like change the formula. You know, in other words, you know, the mathematical computation to how much one town gets versus another town. And I'm curious about your take on that, because I thought it was kind of interesting that the advocates didn't mention the CJEF case, which is happening right now, and you know, seems to me to be one of the bigger factors in terms of things that could possibly change the way that we do public education funding. So I'm just curious about your take about this press release that came out about changing the funding formula.
A formula is only as good as the money you put into it. And what the CJEF trial has shown is that there's clearly inadequate funding. So to mention tinkering with the school formula without actually talking about, number one, CJEF, and number two, the need to increase funding, is really only talking about a little part of the problem. Often what happens is people who want to tinker with the formula and don't want to talk about the amounts really have a different agenda. They want to fool with the mechanisms of school funding to enable school funding to leave the public school system and go to other schools, like charter schools, and we can talk about that in a different conversation. But to not talk about CJEF in Connecticut when you're talking about school funding, and not talk about the amount of money necessary to provide an adequate education for all children, does an injustice to all children in Connecticut. Mm-hmm. And I just want to say that it's not only the CJEF districts that will benefit from this school funding case. It's every school district, or many school districts, not just the CJEF districts, have been struggling with trying to balance inadequate, cut other services or cut school services in order to fund what they need to in their district. So if more school funding were to be coming from the state, it would ease up money to provide other essential services. And it would enable them to provide the services to their kids, because many districts here have a growing ELL population, for example.
ELL meaning English language learners, or another term is bilingual student. So yeah, is that, I just wanted to
Correct.
clarify. Okay.
Correct.
All right. So I want to wrap up. We're running out of time, but I wanted to just invite you to join me again at some point when the CJEF case has been decided, when we have some decision from the court, and also invite you to maybe talk some charter schools, charter school funding, and that sort of thing next time. So, you want to have any final words, Wendy?
No, thanks very much, Robert.
All right.